So we are going to explore the concept of inferences. And for those of you familiar with our work, you'll know that inferences represent one of the elements of reasoning, one of the 8 elements of reasoning. And we're going to burrow into that conception today. I'd like to turn it over to you, Gerald, to introduce us to the concept of inferences.
Okay, well, good. Glad to do it. So there's a lot I could say about inferences, and we're going to be discussing aspects of it. There's a sense in which the words inference and conclusion are synonymous, and there's another way in which they're a little bit different. The word inference is actually ambiguous. It's got 2 different senses. One is that it's the conclusion you draw. So I'm making the inference to such and such. It's the conclusion that you draw. So inference in that way represents the statement that you're drawing out of the information plus assumption. But there's another meaning of the word inference in that the inference is not what you arrive at, but it's the going from the information and the assumption to the conclusion. That is, inference can mean making an inference or drawing a conclusion. So the classic conception of reasoning is that you start with something and you see what follows logically, what makes sense the way it follows. And when that follows, that's your inference, or that's a good inference. It's a sound or valid inference based on your information and assumptions. But there's a variety of inference that we list as among the elements of reasoning in that wedge devoted to inferences that I want to say a little bit about. And that's interpretation. So whenever we interpret something, we're making an inference. We're drawing a conclusion. So if I interpret your behavior, I notice what your behavior is, and I come to a conclusion about it. That's what an interpretation is. So interpretation is an intrinsically important part of inference, and it's not usually mentioned very much in the classical account of reasoning. But notice that you're making inferences all the time in your life. You're making inferences about about going through traffic, about friends you meet, all those interpretations in your life about how to live your life better, how to live your life at all. You're making inferences, what to have for dinner. You're constantly making inferences. That's not to say that we're always making good inferences. It's not to say that we're always making inferences that are clear or accurate or relevant to the issue at hand, but we're always making inferences. And that actually brings up another kind of ambiguity about inferences in relation to the standards of critical thinking. I just mentioned 3: clear, accurate, and relevant. And there are other standards, of course. But many times, people talk about inferences as if they're something we need to teach our students. We need to teach our students to make inferences. And I worked with ACT, the testing corporation, a few times, and they had a big section on teaching students to make inferences. And I know what they mean when they say that, but that's not what they mean. We're making inferences all the time. All your students make inferences all the time. There's not, when they say, your class was terrible, your class was terrible, that's an inference, right? They observed your class, they drew the conclusion that it was terrible, it's an inference. What we want to teach students is not to make inferences, but to make inferences that meet the standards of critical thinking, meet the criteria. Clarity, accuracy, relevance, with as much precision as is needed, as deep as is necessary, and so forth. So that's a general account of inference.
Well, there are many facets in what you just said. And so let's burrow into some of those. I'd like to just, if I could, articulate the way I understand inferences. So to me, inferences are at the heart of how we make sense of the world.
Mm-hmm.
And so we are continually making inferences.
Mm-hmm.
And that means, when I say continually, I mean, and linguistically. So we are thinking thoughts more or less continually as we're awake. And we're making inferences about what is happening in the world. Just I'm trying to think of another word for continually other than routinely, but it's like it's always happening. It's happening so much. It's like the air we breathe. It's like the concepts we use that we have no awareness of. So that, for example, every time you say something, I have to make sense of what you said. And actually, I wrote a number of notes as you were talking in different directions. And that shows some of my inference making.
Right.
If a teacher were to take this up right now, she would see that I was with you, I was paying attention, and I was trying to make some reasonable moves based on what you have said. All of these are inferences in context. So we can't, as with all of our reasoning, we can't get away from inferences, and but they're usually happening at the unconscious level. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because we have to do lots of things at the unconscious level. I mean, we have to assume that I'm assuming that this building is not going to fall down upon me while I'm talking to you. So I have to be able to take certain things for granted, or I could never even live. And that's how people go through things like post-traumatic stress, because right there, they can't assume things that they should be able to assume about their safety, for example. So to me, inferences are very important in terms of our teaching and learning critical thinking. And I do think that everyone should learn the term inference and use it explicitly.
I do too.
And as you say, we have examples of being able to teach this at the elementary level. So let me give an example of that in relationship to, well, one of the things that I think is important, you talked about the inference making as both the, as it were, conclusion as a form of inference, and also the process that leads you from this is true, or this is what I see, therefore that is true. It's a step of the mind. It's another analogy for this process. And the importance of that, one of the things that's so important about it is that when we make a step with this particular analogy, if I make an inference, if it's a step of my mind, it's a decision that I make. It's an active decision, if you will. A step is active. So I've made I've taken this step. And what is crucial to understand is that whenever I take that step, I might have taken a different step. I might have moved in a different direction. So somebody is, so these are some examples I've used with young children. So I give them this format to complete these sentences. So here is the situation. You come downstairs in the middle of the night and you look next door to the house next door, and you see what appears to be a flashlight moving around in the house. What do you infer? And you can do this with very young children who really can't even write or read. And all their hands go up and they say, there's a thief, there's a burglar. Or, they'll say something, right? And then they may say three different things, or a lot of them will say that. And then you say, okay, that may be true. And this is also part of what they write out. But so you might infer X, but instead you could have inferred Y.
Right.
And this is a skill set that each of us must have if we're going to advance as critical thinkers. Because if I can't see that I made a move and I could have made a different one, And that would have been better than the one I made. If I can't improve in that process,
Mhm.
then I'm going to have difficulty advancing as a thinker.
Yeah.